Hello and welcome to this video. Artificial intelligence in Photoshop has really tossed a lot of my photographic and editing balls way into the air. And I'm not talking here about AI generative fill, but simply noise suppression. It's so good that it's impacting both the shooting and the editing of my images significantly. In all my photographic life, and that now spans more than 40 years, I've always kept my ISO as low as possible. And at times that's meant that I've lost potentially good images. This is because I kept my ISO too low for what I was trying to capture, and as a result I lost critical sharpness. Remember, when we look at the back of the camera, that small LCD looks pretty good, but when we get the image on screen on our computer, sometimes there's that disappointment when we see the loss of critical sharpness. So as I've said, AI noise suppression has thrown my photographic balls way into the air, but in a good way. A few days ago, I was on a beach at sunset looking east. And I deliberately left my tripod in the car, which was just 100 metres from me. As the light faded after the sun slipped below the horizon, I did what would have been unthinkable for me only a very short time ago. I was using a 24-105mm zoom, and I increased the ISO to 1000, so I could shoot handheld with 125th per second at f5.6. Now, of course, by now I'm pretty confident that the 1000 ISO I was using wasn't going to be a problem, and I thought this would make a worthwhile video topic. So with this raw image opened up into Adobe Camera Raw, let me take you through my editing process, and of course will include the noise suppression. Incidentally, and as always for me, it's the image editing that makes this image, but the noise suppression that allows it all to happen. Let's make a start. Global editing is where I start, where my edits affect the entire image. Chromatic aberration in the optics section is a part of my camera's firmware, so that's been taken care of, and I've cropped and straightened the image to my liking. Now, I quite often hit the auto setting at the top right. It's not making a big change here, but it has increased the contrast quite nicely. I know that Adobe Camera Raw will not put me too far wrong by hitting that auto button, and I can use its suggestion as a preset, a starting point. Now, the next issue I tackle is colour balance. Now, there's lots of personal views amongst this, no rights or wrongs. I'm just going to drop that tint down to the left a little bit, and I'm going to push up the temperature because it was quite warm in the sky behind me. Now we can return to these at any time, of course. What I might do here is just drop the exposure down a little bit. And looking at the sand in the foreground more than anything else, let me push up the vibrance a little more. And maybe I'm going to look at the blacks. If I move the slider to the left, see that little highlight that lights up at the top left of the histogram? That tells me I'm starting to block up some of the detail. But we can see that if I am, it's very minimal. And I quite like the contrast I have there. Let's look at the whites here. By moving this to the right, what we're actually doing is we're increasing the contrast in the foreground, and you can see that happening. What I'd like to do next is to look at clarity. I'm going to step the clarity up quite a bit, and I like what that does to the image. But I think I've more or less come to the end of the global editing. I need to darken the right side of the image, but if I darken that, I'm going to get it too dark here. I want to do something with the sky, darken that, but if I do that, I'm going to get the foreground too dark. So this is the point where we need to turn to strategic editing, and we're going to use the masks in Photoshop, which is driven by AI, of course. So let me begin by selecting my masks. and I'm going to select the entire sky. I'm not going to do a great deal of work here, just a little bit, allowing ACR to select the sky for me because I'm pretty confident it's going to do a first-class job. There we can see it. As soon as I start to move the sliders, that overlay will disappear. So what I want to do is to take down some of the highlights of the sky. Let's have a look at the difference that's making. Not massive, but it's helping. I'm also going to take down the exposure of the sky, but I also want more contrast in the sky, and to do that I'm going to bring the blacks down. Now here's a problem. Sometimes when we bring the blacks down to a level we like, it sometimes does a detrimental thing to one small part of the image. So if I wanted to go that far with the blacks, but I didn't quite want that to be as dark as it is, go here and select Subtract. Choose your brush. On the right hand side, keep the flow fairly low, certainly under 20%, and just brush over that area so you can get what we would have used to call having our cake and eating it. But I do need to go back now to the highlights because I want to have a look at the whites and just tweaking that up a little bit. Now I don't want to go any further with that, but I think the top of the sky also needs to be even darker. Again, I've got a problem here, but I'll address that should I need to. Now if we go back to the little cross here, click, and I'm going to select a linear gradient. Click and drag. There you can see the area it's going to affect. Once again, I'm going to touch those highlights, a little bit of exposure, maybe a little bit of blacks. Now we don't need quite so much. Maybe I've gone a little bit too far, something like that. I think I'm more or less happy with that. Now once we've got to that point, if we just click back to the basic edits and it removes all of the masks and the outlines, we just need a moment just to look at the image, because as we do so we can clearly see that this part of the image on the right is the area that's deficient. We need to do something there. A graduated mask is going to help there too. Now I could go back to my masks, open them up and select it, but all I'm going to do is hit the G key, because when I do hit the G key I've automatically got the gradient selected, dragging it as far to the left as I think it's appropriate. Again, drop the highlights down, drop the exposure down, maybe even a little blacks, and increase the whites just to keep the contrast nice on the right hand side. Now once I've done that, a quick look at the left hand side, because quite often there's a little deficiency there. Maybe there is, not quite as much as the right hand side, but again if I touch the G key I've got the gradient that I want. I can click and drag. Very fast to do this work when you're not going through it word for word, of course. Let's drop down the exposure there just a little bit, not very much. So straight away the image is now becoming a little bit more interesting, but I've got a weak area in the sky here. It looks a little bit too bright to me. Now the way I'm going to deal with that is again with a mask, but I'm going to select a brush. So let's do that straight away. I'll go up to this option, select the brush. What do I want to do with those light areas? Well, I want to kill the highlights and I want to take the exposure down. But I also need the image much bigger on screen, so I'm going to enlarge it and I'll drag it over here. The highlights here are not so bad. This one is where I want to start. So I'm going to drop the size of the brush down. Just test the water a little bit by just brushing over this point. Perhaps the flow is a little bit high. I'll drop it a little. And you can see that even these highlights that almost looked as though they were lost to us, they're certainly not. There is tone there. And as long as we take a little bit of care, we can bring that tone through in exactly where we want it. Now don't worry if you make a mistake here, because if you do, you've got the opportunity to add and subtract to the mask you're working on. So if I had decided that I'd made a mistake, I can go to subtract, pick up a brush, and I can repair those areas. It's not difficult to do. Now I've gone ahead and completed those highlights. Make the image as large as you need it and make the brush as small as you need it, because what you need to do is to make the right effect in those highlight areas, but without leaving evidence of your editing. Now the next thing I'd like to do is just lift the tones on this boat because it's in a nice strong compositional position. Let's get it really large on screen, and you're beginning to see the effect of the 1000 ISO, but I've deliberately left the noise suppression until last. What I want to do here is to select my mask brush. So back to my masks, select a brush. What do I want to do here? I want to lighten it just a little bit, not a great deal. Maybe I'll squeeze a bit more saturation into it. But now I just want to move over this area and start to mask. I'm not having a great deal of change there, so I can go back to the exposure and adjust it. Now I can just lift the tones there and there. Remember, I'm working with this image smaller than it could be. It could be a lot larger than this, but just make it as big or as small as you feel you need. And if I feel I can push a little more warmth into this, I can use the temperature and or the saturation. When I'm happy with that, I'm going to hit Control 0 to come out, because if I'm going to do the water around that area, I'm going to use a separate mask for that. Because back to my mask, select the brush. What I want to do with the water is to lift the highlights a little bit and lift the exposure a little bit. How do I know if I've got the setting on the right enough for what I want to do here? Well, it doesn't really matter, because if I start to work and it's too much, I can back it off. If I start to work and it's not enough, well, then I can increase it. So let me pick a little bit. Let me pick this bit down here. There's a good example, I think. Make my brush a little bigger, and there you can see as I just wipe over that area, I'm not making masses of difference, but I think that's just going to be enough just to lighten this area around here. And as I said before, make the image as big or as small as you need it, and the brush the appropriate size, and just lift those tones. What I'm trying to do, as I said earlier on, is just bring our attention more towards the boat. So I'll do one or two more of those and I'll zoom out. Now would be a good time for a timeout. Now, a timeout is when we sit back from our image, walk away if we can, come back in a little while and just take another look. Because as we look critically at the image, I can still see some weakness. Maybe a little bit of darkness needed at the top left corner, maybe the top right corner, and maybe a little bit down the right hand side. I don't think I need a graduated filter for that. I tend to go for the brush so I can put the tone exactly where I want it. Now the shortcut key to select a brush mask is the K key. You can see the masks appear and I have a new mask, but there's the brush. I'm going to move my image so I can see the right hand side. And what do I want to do here? I just want to darken the exposure a little bit. So let me take it down. The flow rate is down quite low. Let's bring it up to just under 20. And there you can see what I'm referring to when I talk about these little areas that just need a little bit of personal touch. Now I think I can use exactly the same settings here in a couple of places, especially up at the top left corner, maybe down to that area, but I think that just about does it. Maybe a little bit down at the bottom edge. Control 0 will fit this on screen and I'll go back to the basic tab. Now we can go ahead and take a look at this noise issue. What I'm going to do here is click and zoom on the mast, and if you look at the bottom left you can see we're up to 200%. Now you can see the noise in the image, and that's a direct result of a 1000 ISO setting, but of course it does ensure a good sharp image. I'm going to open up my detail tab down here, and I'm going to click to start the denoise process. It's very, very quick, very simple, and needs very little skill from us. There we're given a preview, and if I click and drag you can see that little bit of rigging. So when I click you can see the before, and when I release you can see after. Keep your eye on the line there, because the fascinating way this works is how it deals with the noise but doesn't destroy the detail. Now the setting I've got is more or less the average setting of around 50, and that looks pretty good to me. I'm not going to push it up too high. I don't want to make my picture look like a cartoon, but I've got a I've got a very good result here, and when I click Enhance, what you'll notice over here is a wheel, and the blue bar will go around that wheel, because what Photoshop is doing at the moment, it's making a complete duplicate of our image with the AI denoise applied. Now I'll try and think of something intelligent to say while we're waiting for that to complete, just to demonstrate it's not a massively lengthy process either. Now if we were to go into Photoshop's bridge now, you would see two versions of this image. You would see the original raw version, which would encompass the changes that I've made, but alongside it you're going to see one with a slightly different label, which denotes that it's been enhanced with the noise suppression. So all I need to do now is to open this up into Photoshop. Now if you look over the right hand side you can see I've got two versions of this image in a layered stack. This one is without the noise suppression applied, and this one is the image that I've just opened. I think what I'll do first is just right click and zoom this to 200%. Just holding the space bar, click and drag to find a nice spot to view. That looks pretty good. So there you can see the image we've just completed. We can still see a little bit of noise, but that's quite natural in a photograph, and in my view makes it look right. But if I turn on the layer above, which doesn't contain the denoise, we can see the difference. And that is what I think is a game changer, and it's what's thrown all of my photographic balls in the air, but as I said, in a very good way. Control 0 will fit the image back on screen. Let's just take a quick look at the before and after. Now as we view these before and after images, it's worth thinking about the implications of how noise suppression may impact our photography. Handheld night street photography would be a whole lot better because we can achieve a faster shutter speed. Birds in flight, where we need the fastest shutter speeds possible, are going to benefit from higher ISO. And I've shot eagles at 2000 ISO without too much difficulty. When we're working on our images in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom, if Lightroom is your choice, it may allow us to pull up more detail from the dark shadows while being able to mitigate the resulting noise. And don't forget some of your older images that may be well worth a second look. It's made me far more confident to put my times-to converter onto my 100 to 500mm lens and shoot at 1000mm. Using 1000 ISO, and at times I've used 2000 as well. Editing is trying to get the very best out of every exposure, and now I can lean on those sliders a little bit heavier when I need to, safe in the knowledge that I can deal with any downsides of increased noise, starting with global editing first and then strategic editing to give my images impact and appeal. By the way, I'm always looking for ideas for Photoshop videos, and if you have any, please add them below or contact me via the contact page on my website. I do answer all my emails and would welcome some suggestions. Until next time, bye for now.